They said black men couldn't fly, that the laws of physics wouldn't bend for them, that the reflexes, the intelligence, the very mental capacity required to pilot a fighter plane were beyond their reach. Yet, in the savage skies over Europe, they would achieve the impossible, escorting bomber after bomber through walls of enemy fire, bringing them home when others couldn't. The German pilots thought it was propaganda. Reports filtered through Luftwaffe briefing rooms that the Americans were deploying Negro pilots over the Reich. Men they considered biologically inferior, mentally incapable of handling the split-second decisions required in aerial combat. In German squadron headquarters, some scoffed over their schnapps, as if the mere notion of facing such opponents was an insult to their profession. They predicted easy kills, quick victories, but those same pilots would soon encounter aviators who flew with precision in their maneuvers and fury in their hearts. And by war's end, the Italian skies would echo with a very different story. Imagine yourself in early 1941. The war in Europe had been consuming nations for nearly 2 years. The Battle of Britain had just ended with the RAF barely holding the line against the Luftwaffe's relentless assault. London lay in ruins from the Blitz, entire neighborhoods reduced to smoking rubble. In the Pacific, Japan was expanding its empire, swallowing China, threatening Southeast Asia, eyeing the American holdings with hungry calculation. France had fallen. The Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, Norway, all conquered. The Soviet Union would soon be invaded. And in the skies, air superiority meant everything. Control the air, control the battlefield. Lose the air, lose the war. America watched from across the Atlantic, technically neutral, but preparing for the inevitable. Roosevelt knew it was coming. Military planners drew up scenarios. Factories retooled for war production. The nation began to mobilize. But when black Americans stepped forward, eager to serve, ready to fly, the response from their own country was a door slammed in their faces. The United States military in 1941 was not just segregated. It was built on a foundation of scientific racism, dressed up in the language of military efficiency. The Army Air Corps had no black pilots. 0. This wasn't an accident or oversight. It was policy, deliberate and defended. The prevailing belief, stated openly by military officials, was that Negroes lacked the intelligence for aerial combat. Too slow in their reactions, deficient in spatial reasoning, unable to handle the complex mathematics of navigation, the mechanical knowledge required for flight, the quick decision-making demanded in dogfights. These weren't just the ravings of backwoods bigots. These were official positions, backed by what they claimed was science. The Army War College had published studies. Reports circulated through the Pentagon, all reaching the same conclusion. Black men were unsuited for aviation. One study claimed that the Negro brain lacked the proper configuration for the complex motor skills required in flight. Another suggested that the cranial capacity was insufficient for the mental demands. Phrenology dressed up as military necessity. When black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender began campaigning for integration of the Air Corps, when civil rights organizations pressured the White House, the military response was consistent. It's not prejudice, it's biology. It's not discrimination, it's common sense. But pressure was building. The same pressure that had been building across black America for decades. In cities from Harlem to Chicago to Los Angeles, African Americans had been pushing back against Jim Crow, demanding full citizenship, equal rights, the chance to prove themselves. They had PhDs and couldn't teach at white universities. They had medical degrees and couldn't treat white patients. They had engineering skills and were barred from defense plants. The hypocrisy was suffocating. You can die for your country, but you can't fly for it. You can work in airplane factories, but you can't pilot the planes you build. You can sweat and bleed, but you can't touch the controls. The anger was righteous. The frustration was choking. And into this powder keg of potential stepped a few key figures who refused to accept no as a final answer. First, there was Yancey Williams, a private pilot and Howard University student who had learned to fly at his own expense. He applied to the Army Air Corps in 1940 and was rejected without explanation. He applied again. Rejected again. He went to the NAACP. He wrote letters to Congress. He refused to disappear. Then there was the Pittsburgh Courier's campaign. James G. Thompson wrote, a letter to the editor that became a movement, the Double V campaign. Victory abroad against fascism. Victory at home against racism. The paper ran with it, splashing it across their front pages. Thousands rallied behind it. If we're fighting Hitler's theories of racial superiority, they argued, shouldn't we confront our own? Eleanor Roosevelt became an unlikely but crucial ally. In March 1941, she visited Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington. The college had started a civilian pilot training program, and when Mrs. Roosevelt toured the facilities, she did something that made national headlines. She went up in a plane piloted by Charles Chief Anderson, a black flight instructor. Her Secret Service detail nearly had a collective heart attack. A white woman, the First Lady of the United States, trusting her life to a Negro pilot? Scandalous, dangerous, unthinkable. But Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't most white women. She climbed into that two-seater Piper Cub with Chief Anderson at the controls, and they took to the sky over Alabama. When she landed, safe and smiling, she made sure the press knew about it. The message was clear. These men can fly, and fly well. The pressure intensified. The White House couldn't ignore it anymore. Franklin Roosevelt needed black votes. He needed national unity. He needed to at least appear to be fighting for democracy abroad while not completely abandoning it at home. In January 1941, under mounting political pressure, the War Department announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black fighter unit. It was a concession, grudging and hedged with every possible caveat. The training would be completely segregated. The men would train at Tuskegee, far from white cadets. They would have separate facilities, separate instructors, separate everything, and there was an understanding, unspoken but clear. This was an experiment. If they failed, the door would slam shut forever. If they succeeded, well, the military would cross that bridge when they came to it. The message to Black America was clear. We'll give you one chance. 1. Don't screw it up. The weight of that pressure would have crushed lesser men. Picture Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941. Deep South, Jim Crow country, where black people walked on one side of the street, white on the other, where separate water fountains, separate entrances, separate entire worlds existed side by side, but never touching. The Tuskegee Institute sat on the outskirts, a beacon of black education and excellence. Booker T. Washington had built it. George Washington Carver taught there. It was a place where black minds could flourish despite the suffocating racism surrounding it. When the Army announced that flight training would happen at Tuskegee, it was both an honor and a burden. An honor because it recognized the Institute's capabilities and infrastructure. A burden because everyone knew the real reason. Put them somewhere isolated, somewhere controllable, somewhere they can be watched and contained. Build the Tuskegee Army Airfield a few miles from campus. Keep them separate. Make sure they don't contaminate the white cadets training elsewhere. The first class of cadets began arriving in July 1941. They came from across the country, drawn by the impossible dream of flying for their nation. Some had college degrees, others barely a high school diploma. What united them was hunger. Hunger to prove the doubters wrong. Hunger to serve. Hunger to touch the sky. Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was among them. Son of the Army's first black general, Davis was already an officer, a West Point graduate who had spent 4 years in silence. His white classmates at the academy had given him the silent treatment, refusing to speak to him except when required by duty. 4 years of eating alone, studying alone, existing in a bubble of imposed solitude. It would have broken most men. Davis emerged harder than steel. When he arrived at Tuskegee to lead these cadets, he carried with him the weight of every slight, every humiliation, every moment of isolation. He channeled it into excellence. Then there was Captain Lemuel Curtis, a chemistry graduate from Howard University. Curtis had earned his private pilot's license on his own, paying out of pocket for lessons at segregated airfields. When he applied to the Air Corps, he was told to wait, and wait, and wait. The letter finally came. Report to Tuskegee. He nearly wept with relief. Finally, after years of being told no, someone was saying yes. There was George Spanky Roberts, a gifted athlete from West Virginia, who had wanted to fly since he was a boy watching barnstormers at county fairs. His family thought he was crazy. Black folks don't fly planes, his father said. That's white people's business. Roberts didn't care. He'd find a way or die trying. There was Charles DeBow, a quiet, serious young man from Indianapolis who had studied mathematics. He could calculate trajectories in his head, solve navigation problems faster than most could with pencil and paper. His professors had told him he was wasting his talents pursuing aviation. No future in it for someone like you, they said. DeBow ignored them. These men and dozens more descended on Tuskegee in the summer of 1941, ready to prove that black men could fly. What they found was a training program designed to make them fail. The standards were higher than at white flight schools. The washout rate was deliberately harsh. The instructors, both black and white, were under orders to be uncompromising. No one wanted to be the person who let an inferior pilot through because of sympathy or political pressure. So, they made it brutal. Primary flight training started with the PT-17 Stearman, a biplane that was forgiving and stable. The cadets learned basic maneuvers, level flight, turns, climbs, descents. Then came the moment every pilot remembers, the first solo. Imagine it. You're 21 years old. You've been told your entire life that you can't do this, that your brain isn't wired for it, that the white pilots are inherently better, faster, smarter. You've absorbed those messages despite resisting them. They live in your head like background noise. Now, you're in the cockpit alone. Your instructor has climbed out. The engine is running. The controls are in your hands. Everyone is watching, waiting to see if you'll crack, if you'll freeze, if you'll prove the doubters right. The cadets at Tuskegee felt that pressure every single time they flew. Not just the normal pressure of learning a dangerous skill, the crushing weight of representation. If I fail, it's not just me. It's all of us. Every black person who wants to fly. Every kid back home who dreams of this. If I crash, if I wash out, if I prove them right, I've closed this door for everyone who comes after. That pressure turned training into something beyond difficult. It became existential. Every mistake felt like betrayal. Every success felt like a reprieve, not celebration. The psychological toll was immense. Some cadets cracked under it. They'd make a minor error, panic, spiral, and wash out. Others became so tight with tension, they couldn't fly smoothly. Their movements jerky and overcorrected. The instructors, particularly the black instructors like Chief Anderson and Mother Horn, understood this. They'd seen it before. They'd felt it themselves. So they were tough, demanding, uncompromising, but also subtly supportive. A word after a rough flight, a nod after a good landing. Small gestures that said, "I know what you're carrying. Keep going." The white instructors varied. Some were genuinely invested in these cadets' success, believing the opportunity was long overdue. Others were skeptical, waiting for the experiment to fail so they could return to business as usual. And a few were actively hostile, grading harder, criticizing more, doing everything just short of overt sabotage to make these men fail. The cadets learned to read the instructors fast. They knew who would give them a fair shake and who was looking for reasons to wash them out. They adjusted their performance accordingly, becoming experts at navigating not just the sky, but the minefield of racial politics on the ground. By the end of primary training, the class had shrunk. Some washed out due to inability, some due to pressure, some due to instructors who decided they weren't quite ready, a euphemism everyone understood. The men who survived moved to basic training, flying the BT-13 Vultee Valiant, a heavier, faster, less forgiving aircraft. The stakes got higher. Advanced training meant the AT-6 Texan, a plane that could kill you if you weren't careful. The cadets learned aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery. They shot at towed sleeves from the back seat while their instructors flew. They practiced emergency procedures, engine-out landings, forced descents, every skill they'd need to survive combat. And through it all, the knowledge that they were being watched, not just by their instructors, but by the Army brass, by congressmen, by civil rights leaders, by black newspapers whose correspondents regularly visited to document the experiment. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a stake in whether these men succeeded or failed. The tension wasn't just academic. In the towns surrounding Tuskegee, Jim Crow was alive and thriving. The cadets in uniform, preparing to risk their lives for their country, still had to sit in the back of the bus. Still couldn't eat at white restaurants. Still faced the constant low-level harassment of Southern racism. There were incidents. A cadet refused to move to the back of a bus and was arrested. Another was beaten by local police for talking back. The contrast was sickening. During the day, they were training to be officers and fighter pilots. At night, they were just another group of black men in the Jim Crow South, subject to all the violence and humiliation that entailed. This duality became part of their identity. They existed in two Americas simultaneously. The America that desperately needed pilots and was willing to tolerate black aviators out of necessity, and the America that still saw them as fundamentally lesser, undeserving of basic dignity and respect. They learned to code switch, to compartmentalize, to carry themselves with pride, while navigating a system designed to diminish them. By March 1942, the first class was ready to graduate. 5 men had made it through the entire program: Benjamin O. Davis Jr., George Roberts, Charles DeBow, Mac Ross, and Lemuel Curtis. 5 men out of 13 who started. The attrition rate was savage, higher than at white flight schools, but these 5 had done it. They had earned their wings. The graduation ceremony at Tuskegee was electric. Black families from across the region descended on the airfield. Photographers from black newspapers crowded the flight line. Eleanor Roosevelt sent a telegram of congratulations. For a moment, all the pressure, all the doubt, all the weight seemed to lift. These men had proven something fundamental. The theories about cranial capacity and mental deficiency? Lies. The claims about biological unsuitability for flight? Nonsense. 5 black men now wore silver wings on their uniforms. 5 black men were now U.S. Army Air Corps pilots. The door hadn't just cracked open. It had been kicked down. But graduation was just the beginning. These men weren't pilots yet. Not really. They were flight school graduates. To become true combat aviators, they'd need more training, more testing, more proving themselves. And the biggest test was still coming. Because being able to fly was one thing. Being able to fight, to kill, to survive aerial combat against the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots? That was something else entirely. As more classes graduated, the 99th Pursuit Squadron grew. New pilots arrived, fresh from training, eager and nervous. Davis, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, commanded the unit. They trained in Alabama through the summer and fall of 1942, flying P-40 Warhawks, the same fighters used in North Africa and China. The P-40 was a solid aircraft, if somewhat outmatched by the latest German and Japanese fighters. But it was tough, could take a beating, and in the right hands, it was lethal. The pilots practiced constantly. Dogfighting maneuvers, dive bombing runs, strafing passes, navigation exercises across the Alabama countryside. They flew until their arms ached from wrestling the controls, until they could identify aircraft silhouettes in a split second, until flying became as natural as walking. And always, the pressure, the knowledge that they were still an experiment, one failure away from the entire program being shut down. One crash blamed on incompetence rather than bad luck or mechanical failure, and it would be over. One pilot freezing in combat, one instance of cowardice, real or perceived, and generations of black Americans would be denied this chance. The psychological burden never eased. If anything, it intensified as deployment approached. Because soon, they wouldn't just be flying over Alabama. They'd be flying over Europe, where German pilots with years of combat experience waited. where anti-aircraft fire filled the sky like deadly rain, where a single mistake meant death, and mistakes would be magnified, analyzed, used as proof that the experiment had failed. In the back of every pilot's mind was the same question. What happens when we face the Luftwaffe? Will we measure up? Will we survive? Will we prove that we belong here? The questions haunted their training flights, invaded their dreams, sat with them at the dinner table. And in April 1943, they got their answer. The 99th received orders. Prepare for deployment overseas. They were going to war. The departure from the United States was bittersweet. On one hand, finally, the chance to prove themselves in combat. On the other, leaving behind families, loved ones, the communities that had believed in them when no one else would. The pilots of the 99th said their goodbyes at Tuskegee, then boarded trains north to Camp Shanks, New York, the departure point for overseas deployment. The journey took them through a country still deeply divided, through states where their uniforms meant nothing, where they still faced discrimination despite being officers in the United States Army Air Forces. At one stop, several pilots entered a restaurant for a meal. They were refused service. Officers in uniform, about to risk their lives for their country, told to leave because of their skin color. They left without causing a scene, swallowing the anger, adding it to the vast reservoir of rage they'd learned to contain. This too was part of being a Tuskegee Airman, fighting on two fronts always. In April 1943, they boarded transport ships bound for North Africa. The voyage across the Atlantic was tense. U-boats prowled the shipping lanes. Destroyers circled the convoy like nervous sheepdogs. The men played cards, wrote letters, tried to sleep in cramped quarters below deck. Some were seasick for days. Others adapted quickly. All of them wondered what waited on the other side. When they arrived in Casablanca, the heat hit them like a physical force. Morocco in spring was already scorching, the sun beating down on white buildings and dusty streets. The 99th was assigned to the 12th Air Force, supporting the Allied campaign in North Africa. The fighting here was brutal. Rommel's Africa Corps had been pushed back, but not defeated. The Germans still held Tunisia, still launched fierce counterattacks. The air war was constant, deadly. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs controlled large swaths of sky. Allied pilots died daily. The 99th was stationed at an airfield near Fez, then moved to Ouled Jalal in Algeria. The conditions were harsh. The desert airfields were primitive, just cleared dirt with some tents and maintenance equipment. Dust storms could ground flights for days. The heat was oppressive. Water was scarce. And the reception from white American units was cold at best, hostile at worst. Other squadrons watched the black pilots with undisguised skepticism. Some refused to share facilities, creating unofficial segregation even in a combat zone. Others spread rumors. These guys are going to get people killed. They're not ready. This whole thing is a political stunt. The 99th had expected this, but expecting it and experiencing it were different things. They kept to themselves, focused on their mission, and waited for their chance to fly. That chance came in early June 1943. The 99th flew its first combat mission on June 2nd, a dive-bombing and strafing run against the Italian-held island of Pantelleria in the Mediterranean. Picture that moment. Lieutenant Colonel Davis leading his pilots into their first real combat. No more training exercises. No more simulations. Real enemy guns. Real anti-aircraft fire. Real possibility of death. Music. The target was a small volcanic island fortress that the Allies needed to neutralize before invading Sicily. The Germans and Italians had fortified it heavily, bristling with coastal guns and anti-aircraft batteries. The 99th's mission was to bomb and strafe the defenses, softening them up for ground assault. As the P-40S approached the island, the sky erupted with flak. Black bursts of exploding shells created a deadly gauntlet. The pilots pushed through, diving toward their targets, releasing bombs, pulling up hard, banking away. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the concussion of explosions. It was chaos, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Every pilot made it back. No losses on the first mission. Relief flooded through the squadron, but also a strange letdown. They'd done their job, but nothing spectacular had happened. No dramatic dogfights, no heroic victories, just a workmanlike completion of a dangerous task. The missions continued through June. Strafing runs, bomber escorts, ground support for advancing Allied troops. The 99th flew and fought and survived, but they weren't getting the headlines they needed. Music back in the States, black newspapers covered their deployment extensively, but the mainstream press barely mentioned them. White correspondents with the 12th Air Force wrote about other squadrons, other victories. The 99th was largely invisible, and in military circles, doubts persisted. Sure, they hadn't failed catastrophically, but they also hadn't proven themselves exceptional. The bar for black pilots was always higher. White. Units could have mediocre days, and it meant nothing. The 99th had mediocre days, and it was evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Then came July 2nd, 1943, a day that would define the squadron. The 99th was flying bomber escort over Sicily, protecting American AE-20 light bombers as they struck German positions. The bombers were vulnerable, slow, loaded with explosives, easy prey for enemy fighters if left undefended. The P-40S circled above, scanning the sky. Then someone called out on the radio, "Bandits, 3 o'clock high." German Focke-Wulf 190s, coming in fast. The FW-190 was one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters, faster and more heavily armed than the P-40. The German pilots were experienced, veterans of years of combat. Everything the critics said would overwhelm the black pilots. Here it was. The real test. Lieutenant Charles Hall was flying wing for Captain Davis when he spotted the enemy fighters. His pulse hammered. His hands gripped the control stick. Every instinct screamed caution, but his training took over. He radioed his position, checked his six, and turned into the attack. The Germans dove toward the bombers. Hall dove after them. The sky became a swirling, twisting maze of aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked past. Planes rolled, climbed, dove. Hall locked onto a Focke-Wulf, got behind it, and opened fire. His .50 caliber machine guns roared. He could see his rounds striking the German fighter, pieces of metal tearing away. The FW-190 started smoking, rolled over, and went down. First kill by a Tuskegee Airman. First proof that they could fight and win against the Luftwaffe's best. Hall's voice on the radio. "I got him! I got him!" The elation was unmistakable. Not just personal victory, but validation. For the entire squadron. For every black pilot. For everyone who had believed this was possible. When the formation returned to base, Hall was swarmed by his fellow pilots. Handshakes, backslaps, joy. But also relief. They'd needed this. One confirmed kill wouldn't silence all the critics, but it was a start, a foothold, proof that when tested, they could deliver. The Associated Press picked up the story. First, Negro flyer shoots down Nazi plane. The black press went wild. The Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, Baltimore Afro-American all ran front-page stories. Charles Hall became a hero overnight. But Hall himself remained humble. In interviews later, he always emphasized, "It wasn't just me. It was training. It was my wingman. It was the entire squadron working together. This wasn't individual glory. It was collective achievement." The victories continued. Through July and August 1943, the 99th flew missions over Sicily as the Allies invaded the island. They strafed German convoys, escorted bombers, provided close air support for ground troops. The pilots became more confident, more aggressive. They were no longer the nervous rookies wondering if they belonged. They were combat veterans now, blooded and proven. But even as they racked up successes, trouble was brewing back at headquarters. Some white commanders in the 12th Air Force had been watching the 99th closely, looking for reasons to justify their prejudices. And they thought they'd found them. In September 1943, a damning report circulated through Army Air Force's headquarters. Written by Colonel William Momier, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group to which the 99th was attached, it claimed the black pilots were ineffective in combat. According to Moumier, they lacked aggressiveness, hesitated in engagements, failed to protect bombers adequately. The report recommended that the 99th be removed from combat and reassigned to coastal patrol or other non-combat duties. The report was devastating. Everything the pilots had feared, the knife they'd known was waiting to be plunged into their backs, here it was. And it wasn't based on objective data. The 99th's loss ratios were comparable to other P-40 squadrons. Their mission completion rates were solid, but Moumier cherry-picked incidents, highlighted problems, and ignored successes. It was a hatchet job, pure and simple. When word of the report reached the pilots, rage and despair battled for dominance. They'd done everything asked of them. They'd fought and bled, and some had died. And it still wasn't enough. The system was still looking for ways to discard them. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, now back in Washington for consultations, found himself defending his men before the War Department committee. He was calm, methodical, presenting evidence that contradicted Moumier's claims. The statistics didn't support the conclusions. The 99th's performance was at least average, arguably above average, given their limited experience and inferior aircraft. Davis made his case with controlled passion. These men have proven themselves. They deserve to continue fighting. Removing them from combat would be a grave injustice and a strategic error. The committee deliberated. For weeks, the 99th's fate hung in the balance. Back in North Africa, the pilots flew their missions, not knowing if each sortie would be their last. The black press mobilized, running editorials, organizing letter-writing campaigns, pressuring Congress. Civil rights organizations lobbied the White House. The political pressure intensified. Finally, in October 1943, the decision came down. The 99th would remain in combat. The War Department cited insufficient evidence for Moumier's claims and noted that removing the unit would harm morale, both in the military and on the home front. It was a reprieve, but a narrow one, and the message was clear. You're still being watched, still being judged by a harsher standard. One more slip, and you're done. The pilots absorbed this lesson. They'd won a battle, but not the war. They'd have to keep proving themselves, again and again, indefinitely. Meanwhile, back at Tuskegee, more pilots were graduating. The program had expanded dramatically. 3 more squadrons had been formed, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Together with the 99th, they would comprise the 332nd Fighter Group, an entirely black fighter unit. The 332nd trained through late 1943 and early 1944, preparing for deployment. These new pilots learned from the 99th's experiences. They studied combat reports, absorbed lessons, trained even harder. They knew what awaited them. Not just enemy fighters, but the crushing weight of representation, the skepticism of white commanders, the constant need to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. In January 1944, the 332nd deployed to Italy. The fighting there was brutal. The Allies had invaded the Italian peninsula, but faced fierce German resistance. The terrain favored the defenders. Mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, perfect for ambushes. The Germans had dug in along the Gustav Line, anchored by Monte Cassino, and they weren't giving ground easily. The 332nd was based at Ramatelli Airfield near the Adriatic coast. Unlike the primitive desert strips in North Africa, Ramatelli was more developed, with better facilities and infrastructure. But the missions were far more dangerous. The Luftwaffe in Italy was experienced and aggressive. They flew Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, aircraft superior to the P-40S. And the German pilots knew their business. Many were aces with dozens of kills. The 332nd would have to be very good and very lucky to survive. Their first missions were ground support and bomber escort, similar to what the 99th had done in North Africa. But the intensity was higher. More enemy fighters, more anti-aircraft fire, higher stakes. The pilots adapted quickly. They had to. In February 1944, the 332nd began transitioning to a new aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a beast of a plane, massive and heavily armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns. It could take tremendous punishment and keep flying, but it was also heavy, less maneuverable than the nimble Messerschmitts. The pilots learned to use its strengths: dive like a rock, hit hard, and zoom away. They developed tactics that played to the P-47's capabilities while minimizing its weaknesses, and they painted their planes with distinctive markings. The tail assemblies were painted red, bright crimson that stood out against the sky. Some say it was to identify each other in the chaos of combat. Others claim it was a statement: we're here, we're visible, and we're not hiding. The red tails became their trademark. Bomber crews started calling them Red Tail Angels because of their reputation for staying with the bombers, never abandoning them to chase personal glory. That reputation was hard-earned and absolutely crucial. See, fighter escort was a delicate balance. Your job was to protect the bombers, but enemy fighters would try to lure you away, baiting you into chasing them while others attacked the bombers. Many escort squadrons fell for this, pilots breaking formation to pursue kills, leaving the bombers vulnerable. Not the Red Tails. They stayed tight. If German fighters attacked, the Red Tails engaged them close to the bombers, driving them off rather than pursuing them to destruction. It was disciplined, professional, and exactly what bomber crews needed. The bomber crews noticed. White airmen who might never have willingly flown with black pilots in peacetime started specifically requesting the Red Tails as their escorts. "Get me those guys with the Red Tails," they'd say in mission briefings. Not because of politics or progressivism, but because they wanted to survive, and the Red Tails brought them home. The statistics bore this out. The 332nd Fighter Group would eventually fly over 15,000 sorties. They would escort over 200 bomber missions, and their record would become legendary. Never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. Never. That's an astonishing statistic. Other escort groups lost bombers regularly. It was considered inevitable. But not with the Red Tails. When they were on escort, the bombers came home. Now, it's important to note, some bombers were lost to anti-aircraft fire or mechanical failure. The Red Tails couldn't protect against flak or engine trouble. But enemy fighters, those they handled, aggressively and effectively. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical escort mission looked like. It's March 1944. The target is a ball-bearing factory in Germany, critical to the Nazi war machine. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, dozens of them, form up over Italy and head north. Each bomber carries 10 men and thousands of pounds of explosives. They fly in tight formations, so close that a moment's inattention could cause a mid-air collision. The bombers are slow, lumbering, vulnerable. The Red Tails take off before dawn, climbing to meet the bombers at the rendezvous point. They slide into position above and beside the bomber formations, weaving back and forth, scanning the sky constantly. The pilots are on edge. The flight to the target will take hours. Hours of vigilance, knowing that enemy fighters could appear at any moment. As they cross into German-held territory, the flak starts. Black puffs of exploding shells dot the sky. The bombers fly straight through it, maintaining formation despite the danger. The Red Tails bob and weave, trying to avoid the worst of it while staying close to the bombers. Then, the call every escort pilot dreads. Bandits, 11 o'clock, coming in high. Messerschmitts, diving from above, trying to hit the bombers before the escorts can react. The Red Tails immediately turn into the attack. They don't wait for the enemy to reach the bombers. They intercept early, forcing the Germans to fight them first. The sky erupts into chaos. Aircraft wheeling, diving, climbing. Tracer rounds streaking in every direction. Radio chatter fills the headsets. "On your 6. I got him. Break left." The bombers maintain formation, trusting the escorts to handle the fighters. And the Red Tails do. They engage the Messerschmitts aggressively, shooting down several, damaging others, forcing the rest to break off. But they don't pursue. They return to the bombers immediately, resuming escort positions. Minutes later, more enemy fighters appear. Focke-Wulfs this time, coming from a different angle. Again, the Red Tails intercept. Again, they drive them off. This pattern repeats throughout the mission. Attack, engage, repel, return to formation. Discipline under fire. Teamwork under pressure. The bombers reach the target, drop their payload, and turn for home. The Red Tails stay with them the entire way, fending off repeated attacks. Some Red Tail pilots fly multiple engagements in a single mission, burning through ammunition, pushing their aircraft to the limit. When they finally land back at Ramitelli, exhausted and drained, the ground crews mob them with questions. How many did you get? Everyone make it back? The pilots climb out of their cockpits, legs shaky, hands trembling from adrenaline crash. They debrief, comparing notes, confirming kills, checking for damage to aircraft, and then they rest, knowing they'll do it all again tomorrow. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails had earned grudging respect from even their harshest critics. The bomber crews loved them. Other fighter groups acknowledged their skill. Even German pilots began mentioning them in interrogation reports. Those American fighters with the Red Tails, very aggressive, very disciplined. But respect didn't mean equality. Back at base, segregation still reigned. Officers' clubs were segregated. Mess halls were segregated. Recreation facilities were segregated. The black pilots ate in separate areas, slept in separate quarters, socialized in separate spaces. They could fly and fight alongside white pilots, but they couldn't eat dinner with them. The absurdity was maddening. They were good enough to die for white bomber crews, but not good enough to share a table with white officers. This contradiction ate at the men. Some became bitter. Others channeled it into dark humor. A few simply compartmentalized, focusing on the mission and ignoring everything else. But it was always there, the knowledge that no matter what they accomplished, no matter how many missions they flew or enemies they destroyed, they were still considered lesser. Still black in a white man's military. Then came an incident that brought everything to a head. In April 1944, a group of black officers, including some pilots from the 477th Bombardment Group, a black bomber unit training stateside, attempted to enter the officers' club at Freeman Field, Indiana. They were arrested. The base commander had issued orders that the club was for white officers only, despite regulations stating that all officers, regardless of race, had access to such facilities. The arrested officers refused to back down. They demanded their rights as commissioned officers. The incident became national news, highlighting the ongoing discrimination even within the military. It was called the Freeman Field Mutiny, though it was less mutiny and more principled stand against injustice. The officers were eventually exonerated, but the incident underscored what every black serviceman knew. The uniform changed nothing. The sacrifice changed nothing. Not yet, anyway. Back in Italy, the Red Tails continued their relentless campaign. Through the spring and summer of 1944, they flew mission after mission. Some days were quiet, just long hours of formation flying with no enemy contact. Other days were absolute chaos, multiple engagements, aircraft damaged, close calls that left pilots shaking. The cumulative stress was enormous. Combat flying wasn't just about the moments of actual fighting. It was the anticipation, the constant alertness, the knowledge that any flight could be your last. It wore men down psychologically, physically, emotionally. Some pilots developed what they called the shakes, a fine tremor in their hands that wouldn't go away. Others had nightmares, waking up screaming, reliving dogfights, or seeing friends die. The flight surgeons watched carefully for combat fatigue, the invisible wound that could be just as dangerous as any bullet hole. But there was no rotation home for most of these pilots. The military needed them in the air. So they flew and fought and tried to stay sane. They developed coping mechanisms. Some pilots became superstitious, wearing the same lucky scarf or refusing to shave before missions. Others became deeply religious, finding solace in prayer and scripture. A few turned to alcohol, though the command tried to limit that. Most just relied on each other, the bonds of brotherhood forged in combat. They looked out for their wingmen, both in the air and on the ground. If a pilot was struggling, others would talk to him, cover for him, help him through it. This was more than a squadron. This was family. In June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy changed the calculus of the war. D-Day opened a second front, forcing Germany to fight on two massive fronts simultaneously. The pressure on the Wehrmacht intensified. In Italy, the Allies pushed north, breaking through German defensive lines. Rome fell. The Gothic line was breached, and through it all, the Red Tails flew, providing air support, escorting bombers, strafing enemy positions. Then came a mission that would become legendary. On June 9th, 1944, the 332nd was escorting B-24 Liberators on a raid deep into Germany. The target was an oil refinery, critical infrastructure for the Nazi war machine. The mission was long, dangerous, over heavily defended territory. As the formation approached the target area, they were jumped by German fighters. Not a few, but dozens. Bf-109s and FW-190s, diving from altitude, trying to overwhelm the escorts and reach the bombers. The Red Tails met them head-on. What followed was one of the largest aerial engagements the 332nd would ever fight. The sky became a swirling mass of aircraft. Fighters twisted and dove, trying to get position on each other. The bomber gunners opened up with their .50 calibers. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of engines and guns. Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester was in the thick of it. He'd already shot down 2 German fighters in previous missions, making him an ace in training, if not officially. Today, he would add to that total. Lester spotted a Bf-109 diving toward a bomber. He rolled inverted, pulled through, and came up behind the German. One burst from his guns, and the 109 exploded, disintegrating in midair. No time to celebrate. Another enemy fighter on his right. Lester turned hard, pulling G's until his vision started to gray at the edges. He fired again, hitting the German's engine. The FW-190 streamed smoke and dove away, probably finished. Lester pulled up, scanning for his wingman, checking his fuel. Still good. He rejoined the formation. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. When it was over, the Red Tails had shot down 5 confirmed enemy aircraft with several more probable kills. More importantly, every single bomber made it through the fighter attacks. Some were damaged by flak. One had to make an emergency landing, but not one was lost to enemy fighters. The bomber crews returned to base, singing the praises of the Red Tails. "Those guys saved our lives," one gunner told a reporter. "Jerry had us dead to rights, and those Red Tails came out of nowhere, just tore into them. I never saw anything like it." Stories like this spread through the bomber groups. The reputation grew. The Red Tail Angels were more than a nickname. They were a lifeline, a guarantee that when things got desperate, these pilots would be there, fighting to bring you home. By July 1944, the 332nd began receiving a new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. If the P-47 was a battering ram, the P-51 was a Rapier. Sleek, fast, with incredible range and maneuverability. It was the best fighter aircraft of the war, bar none. The Mustang could outrun, outturn, and outfight anything. The Luftwaffe had. And in the hands of the Red Tails, it became absolutely lethal. The pilots fell in love with the Mustang immediately. It responded to controls like an extension of your thoughts. It climbed like a rocket. It dove like a falcon. And it had legs, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The transition training was brief. These were experienced combat pilots now, not rookies. They adapted quickly, learning the Mustang's characteristics, its quirks, its capabilities. And then they took it to war. The Mustangs were also painted with red tails, continuing the tradition. But now they had the aircraft to match their reputation. White bomber crews, seeing P-51s with red tails pull into escort position, would relax slightly. They knew they were in good hands. The missions continued through the summer and into fall. The war was turning decisively against Germany. The Soviets were grinding forward in the east. The Western Allies had broken out from Normandy and were racing across France. In Italy, the front moved steadily north, but the Germans fought with desperate ferocity. They knew they were losing, but they wouldn't surrender, so the killing continued. And in the sky, the Red Tails continued their grim work. One pilot who exemplified the Red Tail's excellence was Captain Joseph Ellsbury. A quiet, focused pilot from Ohio, Ellsbury had a natural gift for aerial combat. He could see enemy aircraft before others, anticipate their moves, position himself perfectly. By late 1944, he was one of the squadron's top aces. On one mission in July, Ellsbury demonstrated the skill that made him legendary. The 332nd was escorting bombers over Hungary when they were engaged by German fighters. Ellsbury and his wingmen became separated from the main formation during the initial clash. As they tried to rejoin, Ellsbury spotted something below, a Luftwaffe airfield with aircraft taking off. Without hesitation, Ellsbury dove. His wingman followed, probably thinking Ellsbury had lost his mind. Attacking an enemy airfield with just 2 planes? Suicidal. But Ellsbury had calculated the odds and decided they were good enough. He came in low and fast, catching 3 German fighters as they were climbing out after takeoff. Vulnerable, slow, perfect targets. Ellsbury shot down all 3 in rapid succession. Boom, boom, boom. His guns barely cooled between kills. Then he pulled up hard, his wingman right with him, and they climbed back to altitude. The entire attack took maybe 60 seconds. When they landed, Ellsbury reported the engagement matter-of-factly, as if it was routine. 3 kills in 1 pass. His squadron mates were stunned and impressed. That kind of shooting, that kind of judgment, it was extraordinary. Then there was Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, a pilot from New York with a degree from Springfield College. Brown was intellectual, thoughtful, but absolutely fearless in combat. In March 1945, Brown would achieve something remarkable, shooting down a Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was terrifying. It was faster than anything the Allies had, could climb like crazy, and packed devastating firepower. When they appeared in late 1944, they wreaked havoc on bomber formations. Traditional tactics didn't work against them. They were just too fast. But they had weaknesses. They burned fuel quickly. They were less maneuverable than propeller fighters, and they were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage disappeared. Brown had studied the 262s, reading intelligence reports, talking to pilots who had encountered them. He developed tactics specifically for engaging jets. When he finally got his chance, he was ready. The 332nd was near Berlin, escorting bombers, when Brown spotted a 262 making a high-speed pass at the bomber formation. The jet flashed past, too fast to intercept, but Brown tracked its trajectory, calculated where it would be after it completed its attack run. Jets couldn't turn tight. They had to make wide, sweeping turns to maintain speed. Brown positioned himself perfectly. When the Me-262 came around for a second pass, Brown was waiting. He led the target, accounting for the jet's speed, and fired. His rounds struck home. The 262 shuddered. Smoke poured from its engines, and it tumbled from the sky. Brown had just shot down one of the most advanced aircraft in the world using a propeller-driven fighter and superior tactics. The kill was confirmed, verified by multiple witnesses. Roscoe Brown became one of the few Allied pilots to down a jet. When asked about it later, Brown was characteristically modest. It was about understanding the aircraft's limitations and exploiting them. The 262 was fast, but speed isn't everything. That kind of tactical thinking, that ability to analyze and adapt, it characterized the Red Tail's approach to combat. As 1944 turned to 1945, the end was in sight. Germany was collapsing. Allied armies were closing in from all directions. In the air, the Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, pilots, aircraft. The missions became less dangerous in some ways, simply because there were fewer enemy fighters to engage. But they were also more desperate. The Germans who still flew were often fanatics, willing to ram Allied aircraft if they ran out of ammunition. The Red Tails remained vigilant, professional, deadly. They continued to escort bombers, protect their charges, bring them home. The statistics were piling up. By war's end, the 332nd Fighter Group would have flown over 15,000 sorties, escorted over 200 bomber missions, shot down 112 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, destroyed another 150 aircraft on the ground, damaged or destroyed numerous locomotives, trucks, boats, and other targets, earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, received 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, lost 66 pilots killed in action. That last number deserves reflection. 66 men who came through Tuskegee, who earned their wings, who proved themselves in combat, who died far from home in service to a country that didn't fully accept them. Each one represents a family shattered, dreams unfulfilled, potential lost. The survivors carried those names with them forever. Pilots they'd trained with, flown with, laughed with, gone down in flames, or simply disappeared, never seen again. The weight of those losses never left. But even in loss, there was something profound. These men had volunteered, knowing the odds. They'd fought despite the prejudice, despite the discrimination, despite every reason to say, "This isn't my fight." They'd fought because it was their fight, not just against fascism abroad, but against the assumptions and limitations imposed on them at home. Every mission was an act of defiance. Every victory was proof of capability. Every safe return was validation. Let me tell you about one particular pilot who embodied this spirit, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander who had led them from the beginning. Davis had carried an enormous burden. As the highest-ranking black officer in the Air Corps, he was both role model and target. Every decision he made was scrutinized, criticized, second-guessed. White commanders questioned his judgment. Some black community leaders worried he wasn't aggressive enough in confronting racism. He navigated these pressures with dignity and steel. Davis led from the front. He flew combat missions when he could have stayed safely at headquarters. He defended his men fiercely while maintaining professional relationships with white commanders who often despised him. He refused to be provoked into reactions that could be used against him or his unit. When faced with blatant discrimination, he documented it, reported it through channels, and continued his mission. This wasn't weakness. It was strategic. Davis understood that one emotional outburst, one moment of justified anger expressed incorrectly, could be used to discredit everything the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished. So he kept his rage controlled, channeled it into excellence, and demanded the same from his men. After the war, Davis would become the first black general in the United States Air Force. He would serve with distinction for decades, breaking barrier after barrier. But in 1944 and 1945, he was just a lieutenant colonel trying to keep his men alive and prove that black pilots belonged in American skies. He succeeded at both. Another pilot worth mentioning is Lee Archer, who would become one of the most decorated Tuskegee Airmen. Archer was from Harlem, a product of that vibrant community that had produced so much talent. He was smooth, confident, gifted. In combat, he was aggressive and skilled, racking up kills and earning the respect of his peers. But Archer also experienced the darker side of being a black pilot. On one mission, his aircraft was badly damaged by enemy fire. He nursed it back toward Allied territory, but it was clear he wouldn't make it to base. He bailed out over Italy, parachuting into territory that had recently been liberated. When he landed, Italian civilians found him. Some were friendly, offering food and shelter. Others were suspicious or hostile. Archer was in full flight gear, obviously American, but his skin color confused people who had never seen a black pilot before. He eventually made it back to his unit, but the experience was a reminder. Even among allies, being black complicated everything. The daily grind of combat wore on all the pilots. It wasn't just the dramatic dogfights or the close calls. It was the routine missions that still carried deadly risk. Engine failures, weather emergencies, navigation errors that could leave you lost over enemy territory, anti-aircraft fire that could swat you from the sky without warning. Every time they climbed into their aircraft, they were gambling with their lives. Some days you won, some days you lost, and some days you watched your wingman lose while you won, and you carried that guilt forever. The psychological toll manifested in different ways. Some pilots became superstitious, as mentioned before. Others became reckless, taking chances that made their commanders nervous. Still, others became withdrawn, quiet, spending their off hours alone rather than socializing. The flight surgeons tried to monitor mental health, but resources were limited, and understanding of combat trauma was primitive. Mostly the pilots relied on each other. They'd talk, play cards, share letters from home, anything to maintain some sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation. They created rituals and traditions, celebrating when someone shot down an enemy aircraft, mourning quietly when someone didn't come back, supporting each other through the endless cycle of mission, debrief, rest, repeat. By April 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. Soviet troops were in Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The Third Reich was in its death throes. The Red Tails flew some of their final combat missions in late April, escorting bombers hitting the last remaining German targets. The Luftwaffe was virtually extinct. Most missions encountered no enemy fighters at all. When they did, the German pilots were often young, inexperienced, flying on fumes in battered aircraft. It was almost sad, shooting them down. Almost. These were still the enemy, still trying to kill them, still deserving no mercy. But the desperation was obvious. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was over. At Ramitelli Airfield, the Red Tails celebrated with controlled joy. They'd survived. They'd won. They'd proven everything they'd set out to prove. But the celebration was muted by exhaustion and loss. So many hadn't made it to this day. So many were buried in foreign soil or lost at sea. The victory was sweet, but it tasted of ash and sorrow. And beneath the joy was another realization. Now what? They'd fought and bled for their country. They'd demonstrated courage, skill, excellence. They'd earned the respect of the white bomber crews who owed them their lives. But would any of that matter when they went home? Would America treat them differently? Would the military finally integrate? Would the barriers fall? Or would they return to the same Jim Crow world they'd left, as if nothing had changed? These questions hung over the victory celebrations like a shadow. The pilots began preparing to return home. Aircraft were maintained, equipment packed, paperwork processed. The 332nd Fighter Group would be deactivated, its pilots dispersed to other units or discharged from service. Some of the pilots wanted to stay in the military, make it a career. Others couldn't wait to leave, to return to civilian life and put the war behind them. But all of them wondered, what would they be returning to? The journey home was long, ships crowded with soldiers, all eager to get back to America. The Red Tails were separated from white units even on the voyage home, segregation maintained even after victory. It was a bitter reminder. Some pilots spent the voyage reading. Others played endless card games. Many just stared at the ocean, processing everything they'd experienced, trying to prepare mentally for whatever came next. When they finally reached American ports, the reception was complicated. Black communities welcomed them as heroes. Parades in Harlem, in Chicago, in Los Angeles. Church services honoring their sacrifice. Families reunited with tearful joy. Young kids asking for autographs, wanting to touch the uniforms of the men who had fought and won. It was beautiful and meaningful. But outside those communities, the wider recognition was sparse. White newspapers barely covered their return. Mainstream America was celebrating the end of the war, but the specific contributions of the Tuskegee Airmen were largely ignored or minimized, and the discrimination continued. Pilots who had commanded respect in Italy found themselves refused service in southern restaurants. Officers who had led men in combat were told to use the colored entrance. Heroes abroad, second-class citizens at home. The contradiction was maddening. Some pilots tried to continue their military careers, but opportunities were limited. The military was downsizing rapidly, and black officers were often the first cut. Those who did stay faced continued segregation and limited advancement. The respect they'd earned in combat didn't translate to respect in peacetime. Others left the military and tried to use their skills in civilian aviation. But the airlines weren't hiring black pilots. Neither were most flying schools or private companies. These men, who had flown some of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, who had hundreds of hours of flight time, who had proven themselves in the crucible of war, couldn't get jobs as commercial pilots. It was absurd and enraging. Some gave up on aviation entirely, finding other careers. Others persisted, eventually finding niches in black-owned businesses or small operations. A few became educators, teaching the next generation. Many carried bitterness about what could have been, careers denied, potential unfulfilled. But despite the obstacles, despite the continued injustice, the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished something irreversible. They had shattered the lie. The entire edifice of scientific racism that claimed black men couldn't fly, couldn't handle complex machinery, couldn't perform under pressure. It had been demolished, not through argument or debate, but through action, irrefutable, documented, witnessed by thousands. The bomber crews knew. The ground crews knew. Even the reluctant white commanders knew. Black pilots could fly, could fight, could excel. That knowledge, once established, couldn't be taken back. The question was, would America acknowledge it? Would the military change? Would society evolve? The answers came slowly, painfully, over decades. But they came. In July 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. It didn't happen overnight. Implementation took years. Some units resisted. Some commanders dragged their feet. But the policy was clear. Segregation in the military would end. This order didn't come from nowhere. It came from pressure, from civil rights organizations who pointed to the war record of black soldiers, from the Tuskegee Airmen themselves, some of whom testified before Congress about their experiences, from the fundamental contradiction of asking men to die for democracy while denying them equality. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was used as evidence in those debates. Look at what they accomplished, advocates argued. Look at the bombers they brought home. Look at the medals they earned. How can you claim they're inferior when the evidence proves otherwise? The military's own data contradicted its prejudices. And slowly, grudgingly, policy changed. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the embodiment of this transformation. After the war, he stayed in the newly formed United States Air Force, becoming one of its first black officers. He commanded fighter wings, then entire air bases. In 1954, he became the first black general in the Air Force. His promotion was both personal achievement and symbolic victory. The man who had endured 4 years of silence at West Point, who had led the 99th and 332nd through combat, who had defended his men against false accusations, now wore stars on his shoulders. Davis continued to break barriers throughout his career. He commanded the 13th Air Force. He served in key positions in the Pentagon. He became a 4-star general, the highest rank in the military. When he retired in 1970, he had served for 35 years, transforming an institution that had once considered him unfit to be an officer. Davis rarely spoke publicly about the discrimination he'd faced. He maintained a dignified reserve, letting his record speak for itself. But in private moments, with other Tuskegee Airmen, he acknowledged the cost, the anger he'd swallowed, the humiliations he'd endured, the toll it took on him personally. His wife, Agatha, had been his anchor, supporting him through decades of struggle. Without her, he often said, he wouldn't have made it. Other pilots found different paths. Some became educators, teaching history, or mathematics, or engineering. They brought their experiences into classrooms, quietly inspiring students, showing young black kids that they could achieve anything. Dr. Roscoe Brown, the pilot who shot down the jet, became president of Bronx Community College, shaping education policy and opportunity for thousands. Some pilots became entrepreneurs, starting businesses, creating opportunities for themselves and others. They applied the same determination that got them through flight school to building companies, navigating the business world's racism with the same strategic thinking they'd used in combat. A few became activists, working directly on civil rights issues. They marched, organized, testified, refusing to accept the status quo. They had faced death in the skies over Europe. They weren't intimidated by Southern sheriffs or hostile politicians, and many just lived their lives, raising families, working jobs, being present in their communities. Not every hero seeks the spotlight. Some just want to live peacefully, to enjoy the life they risked everything to preserve. But even in quietness, their presence mattered. Kids in their neighborhoods knew. That's Mr. Johnson. He flew in the war. That's Mr. Williams. He was a red tail. The knowledge spread through communities, became part of local lore, inspired generations. For decades, though, the Tuskegee Airmen's story remained largely unknown outside black communities. The mainstream history books didn't mention them. The movies about World War II ignored them. The national narrative of the war focused on other stories, other heroes. This wasn't accidental. This was erasure, deliberate or not. The same society that had doubted them before the war wasn't eager to celebrate them after. Acknowledging their excellence meant confronting the lies that had been told about black capability. It meant admitting that segregation and discrimination had been wrong, not just morally, but factually. That was uncomfortable for many white Americans. Easier to just not talk about it. So the Tuskegee Airmen faded from public consciousness. Their children and grandchildren often didn't know the full story. The pilots themselves sometimes didn't talk about it. The war was painful to remember. The discrimination was humiliating to recount. Why dwell on it? Better to move forward. Focus on the present. But history has a way of surfacing. Stories that are suppressed eventually find their way back. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians began researching the Tuskegee Airmen, documenting their achievements, interviewing surviving pilots. Books were published. Academic papers were written. The story began to re-enter public awareness. In 1995, a Hollywood film was made, The Tuskegee Airmen, starring Lawrence Fishburne. It wasn't perfect, took some liberties, but it brought the story to millions who had never heard it. Young black kids saw pilots who looked like them, doing things they'd been told black people couldn't do. The impact was profound. Then came more recognition. In 2007, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen, collectively honoring their service and sacrifice. The ceremony was held in the Capitol Rotunda, the heart of American government. Surviving pilots, now in their 80s and 90s, came to Washington. They stood in their uniforms, decades older, but still carrying themselves with the dignity and pride that had defined them. Some were in wheelchairs. Some needed canes. All of them had waited over 60 years for this recognition. Bush's speech acknowledged the injustice. You faced challenges, you faced injustice, and you were often told you couldn't do it. But you did it anyway. And in the process, you changed our military, and you helped change our nation. The pilots received the medal graciously. But for many, the recognition came too late. So many had died without seeing this day. Charles Hall, who got the first kill, had passed away in 1971. Lemuel Curtis died in 2000. Hundreds of others were gone, never having received the national acknowledgement they deserved. The survivors accepted the medal on behalf of all of them, especially those who hadn't made it. In 2012, another Hollywood film, Red Tails. Produced by George Lucas, starring Cuba Gooding Jr. and Terrence Howard. Again, not perfect, but it introduced the story to a new generation. Kids who weren't even born when the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded learned about the Red Tails through this film. The cycle of remembering continued. Museums began featuring Tuskegee Airmen exhibits. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum has a permanent display. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, opened in 2016, includes extensive coverage of the Tuskegee Airmen. Schools started teaching about them. February, Black History Month, would feature lessons on the Red Tails. Students would write reports, do presentations, learn the names and stories. Surviving pilots became sought-after speakers. They traveled to schools, military bases, conferences. They told their stories, answered questions, inspired audiences. Some found this exhausting, reliving the war and the discrimination over and over. But they did it anyway, because they understood the importance. Young people needed to hear it, needed to know that barriers could be broken, that excellence was possible despite obstacles. The pilots became living links to history, walking reminders of both American achievement and American shame. As the Tuskegee Airmen aged and passed away, each death was marked with military honors. Fighter jets would fly overhead in missing man formation, one peeling away to symbolize the fallen pilot. Flags would be folded and presented to families. Eulogies would recount their service. Local news would cover the funerals. And each time, the story would be told again to another audience. By 2022, only a handful of Tuskegee Airmen remained alive. They were in their late 90s or hundreds, the last living connections to that era. When they speak at events now, people listen with special attention, knowing these voices won't be around much longer. The urgency to preserve their stories has intensified. Video interviews are archived. Oral histories are recorded. Artifacts are collected for museums. The race, against time to document everything before it's lost forever. But what does their story mean for us today? What can we learn from the Red Tails? First, consider the nature of prejudice and how it operates. The military's belief that black men couldn't fly wasn't based on evidence. It was based on assumption, rationalized with pseudoscience, defended with institutional power. When confronted with contrary evidence, the doubters didn't immediately change their minds. They questioned the evidence, raised the standards, looked for reasons to maintain their beliefs. This is how prejudice works. It's not rational, so rational evidence doesn't automatically defeat it. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't prove the doubters wrong with one mission or one victory. They had to prove it repeatedly, consistently, overwhelmingly, and even then, some never accepted it. This teaches us that fighting prejudice requires persistence. One success isn't enough. One achievement doesn't dismantle systemic barriers. You have to keep pushing, keep succeeding, keep proving, even when it's exhausting and unfair. The Tuskegee Airmen understood this. They didn't stop after Charles Hall's first kill. They didn't relax after the Congressional Gold Medal. They kept telling their story, kept pushing for recognition, kept fighting for justice. That persistence matters. Second, consider the burden of representation. Each Tuskegee Airman carried the weight of his entire race on his shoulders. One failure could close doors for millions. That's an impossible burden, psychologically crushing. No white pilot faced that pressure. If a white pilot washed out of training, it reflected on him individually. If a black pilot washed out, it was used as evidence against his entire race. This remains relevant today. When marginalized groups enter spaces they've been excluded from, they often face this same burden. The first woman in a male-dominated field. The first LGBTQ person in a particular role. They're not just representing themselves, they're representing everyone like them. One mistake gets magnified. One success gets minimized as an exception. It's exhausting and unfair. The Tuskegee Airmen's response was to support each other, to build community, to share the burden rather than carry it alone. That's a lesson worth remembering. When you're breaking barriers, find others breaking barriers. Support them. Cover for them. Share the weight. It's too much for one person, but together, it becomes manageable. Third, consider the relationship between excellence and justice. The Tuskegee Airmen achieved excellence. Their combat record was extraordinary. But did excellence bring justice? Not immediately. They came home to the same discrimination. They were denied jobs despite their qualifications. Excellence wasn't enough to overcome systemic racism. But excellence mattered anyway. It provided evidence that couldn't be ignored forever. It inspired others. It created openings for change. It gave civil rights advocates data to use in their arguments. The lesson isn't that excellence guarantees justice. It doesn't. But excellence combined with advocacy, combined with political pressure, combined with persistence, can eventually force change. The Tuskegee Airmen's excellence didn't automatically integrate the military, but it made integration possible. It weakened the arguments against it. It demonstrated what was possible once barriers fell. Fourth, consider the long view of history. The Tuskegee Airmen's story arc spans decades. Their recognition came slowly, piece by piece, over generations. This teaches us patience and persistence. Justice delayed is still justice denied, yes, but sometimes delayed justice is all you're going to get. The question becomes, do you keep fighting for it anyway? The Tuskegee Airmen did. They kept pushing for recognition, even when it seemed futile. They kept telling their stories, even when no one seemed to be listening. And eventually, people listened. Eventually, recognition came. Not in time for everyone, but it came. That's not a happy lesson. It would be better if justice came swiftly, automatically, for everyone who deserves it. But that's not the world we live in. The world we live in requires sustained effort over long periods. It requires people who won't give up, even when progress seems impossible. The Tuskegee Airmen embodied that persistence. They're why we know this story today. Fifth, consider the role of allies. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't succeed alone. They had allies. Eleanor Roosevelt, flying with Chief Anderson, using her platform to advocate. White bomber crews, testifying about being protected by red tails, pushing back against the discrimination. Reporters who covered their achievements. Military officers who gave them fair evaluations. These allies mattered. Not because the Tuskegee Airmen needed white approval to be excellent. They were excellent regardless. But because in a system built on white supremacy, white voices had power that black voices didn't. Allies could open doors, create opportunities, provide cover. This remains relevant. When fighting injustice, allies are crucial. But good allyship looks like Eleanor Roosevelt risking criticism to fly with Anderson. It looks like bomber crews publicly crediting the red tails. It looks like using your privilege to amplify marginalized voices, not to speak for them, but to ensure they're heard. The Tuskegee Airmen story shows both the necessity and the limitations of allyship. Necessary because systemic change requires broad coalitions. Limited because allies can only do so much. The real work, the dangerous work, the work of actually flying into combat, that was done by the Tuskegee Airmen themselves. Sixth, consider the complexity of their choices. The Tuskegee Airmen chose to serve a country that denied them basic rights. They risked their lives for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens. Was that the right choice? It's easy to look back and say yes, because we know how it turned out. But they didn't know. They couldn't be sure their service would lead to anything. They might have died for nothing, forgotten, their sacrifice used to maintain the status quo. Some black intellectuals at the time argued they shouldn't serve, shouldn't fight for a racist nation. Why die for America when America won't live for you? It was a valid argument. The Tuskegee Airmen chose differently. They chose to serve despite the injustice, betting that their service would create leverage for change. They were right, but it wasn't guaranteed. This teaches us that fighting oppression isn't simple. There's no one right way. Some fight from within systems, some fight from outside, some refuse to participate. All these approaches can be valid depending on context. The Tuskegee Airmen chose engagement. Others chose different paths. Both deserve respect. Seventh, consider the personal cost. The Tuskegee Airmen paid a price for their achievements. Some paid with their lives, 66 killed in combat. Others paid with physical injuries, bodies broken, never fully healing. Many paid psychologically, carrying trauma, anger, frustration for decades. They sacrificed their youth, their innocence, their peace of mind. They gave up normal lives to be symbols, representatives, pioneers. That cost is real and shouldn't be romanticized. We celebrate their achievements, rightfully, but we should also acknowledge what it cost them. They shouldn't have had to pay that price. In a just world, they would have been able to serve their country without facing discrimination. They would have come home to opportunity, not more barriers. Their excellence would have been recognized immediately, not decades later. The fact that they succeeded, despite the obstacles, doesn't make the obstacles acceptable. It makes their success more impressive, but also more tragic. They were extraordinary, but they shouldn't have needed to be. That's an important distinction. When we tell stories of people overcoming discrimination, We risk making discrimination seem like a useful challenge, something that builds character. It doesn't. It's a burden and an injustice, period. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame it, but that doesn't make it good. It makes them impressive. Eighth, consider the incomplete nature of progress. The military integrated. That's progress. But racism didn't disappear from the military or American society. It evolved, adapted, found new forms. Black service members today still face discrimination, more subtle perhaps than in 1943, but still present. The Tuskegee Airmen opened doors, but the fight continues. This is important to understand. Their achievements mattered enormously. They changed the military fundamentally, but they didn't solve racism. That's not a criticism of them. It's a recognition that systemic change is slow, incomplete, requires constant effort across generations. The Tuskegee Airmen did their part. Others must do theirs. Progress isn't a line moving steadily upward. It's a struggle, advances and retreats, victories and setbacks. The Tuskegee Airmen secured important victories. Those victories created foundations for future progress. But the work is ongoing, never finished. Ninth, consider the power of documentation and storytelling. The Tuskegee Airmen's story survived because people documented it, preserved it, told it. Black newspapers covered their achievements when white papers ignored them. Families kept records, letters, photographs. Historians researched and wrote. Filmmakers made movies. Teachers taught it in schools. Without that documentation and storytelling, the story might have been lost. Many similar stories were lost, wiped from history because no one preserved them. This teaches us the importance of bearing witness, of recording achievements, of telling stories, not just for glory or recognition, but to create a record that can be used to fight future injustice. The Tuskegee Airmen's documented excellence made it harder for people to claim black inferiority in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Their story became evidence in broader struggles. That's the power of documentation. It creates truth that persists beyond individual memory. 10th, consider what courage actually means. We often think of courage as absence of fear. The Tuskegee Airmen were afraid. They were afraid of dying in combat. They were afraid of failing and proving the doubters right. They were afraid of facing discrimination after coming home. But they acted anyway. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. It's choosing to do what's necessary even when you're terrified. Every time they climbed into their aircraft, they were afraid. Every time they faced discrimination and held their composure, they were afraid. Every time they stood up for themselves or others, they were afraid. But they did it anyway. That kind of courage is accessible to all of us. We might not face aerial combat, but we face our own challenges, our own fears. The lesson from the Tuskegee Airmen is that courage isn't superhuman. It's profoundly human. The choice to act rightly despite fear. We all have that capacity if we choose to exercise it. Now, decades after the war, what remains? The physical artifacts of their story are scattered. 51 Mustangs with red tails in museums, lovingly restored, surrounded by plaques explaining their significance. Visitors stand before them, reading the histories, imagining what it was like to fly them into combat. At Tuskegee, the airfield is now Moton Field, a National Historic Site. Visitors can walk the same ground where cadets trained, see the hangars, imagine the sound of engines warming up at dawn. It's preserved as a reminder, a place of pilgrimage for those who want to connect with this history. In Washington, D.C., there's a memorial to the Tuskegee Airmen, unveiled in 2021. Bronze statues of pilots in flight gear, looking skyward, their names inscribed on walls. Visitors leave flowers, take photos, pay respects. It's a physical manifestation of national acknowledgement, permanent and public. Schools and buildings are named after Tuskegee Airmen. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. has an Air Force base named after him. Lee Archer has a street. Charles Hall has a scholarship fund. These namings keep the memory alive, ensure new generations encounter these names and ask questions. Who were they? What did they do? In living rooms across America, Families have photographs on mantles. Grandpa in his uniform, wings on his chest, pride in his eyes. Children and grandchildren look at these photos and hear stories, often for the first time. Your great-grandfather was a Tuskegee Airman. The family history is preserved, passed down, kept alive through personal connection. In classrooms, teachers use the Tuskegee Airmen as examples when teaching about World War II, about the Civil Rights Movement, about perseverance and excellence. Students write essays, do projects, sometimes correspond with surviving pilots or their families. The story becomes part of their education, shapes how they understand history and possibility. In military training, the Tuskegee Airmen are held up as examples of excellence and perseverance. New pilots, regardless of race, learn about the Red Tail's record. They learn the tactics, the discipline, the commitment to the mission. The Tuskegee Airmen's military legacy isn't just about integration. It's about what it means to be a professional aviator. In popular culture, references appear. Movies, TV shows, books, songs mention the Red Tails. Sometimes accurately, sometimes not, but the awareness spreads. The story enters the collective consciousness, becomes part of the American narrative. And in the minds of people who face their own barriers, who are told they can't, who encounter discrimination and doubt, the Tuskegee Airmen exist as proof that the impossible can become possible. If you're the first in your family to attend college, you might think of the first black pilots breaking into aviation. If you're entering a field where people like you are rare, you might draw strength from knowing others broke similar barriers before. If you're fighting institutional racism, you might remember that. Institutions can change, slowly and painfully, but they can change. The echo of what they accomplished continues through time, reaching forward to this moment. To you, reading or hearing this story. What you do with it is up to you. Maybe you'll share it, tell someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you'll dig deeper, learning more, reading memoirs, watching documentaries. Maybe you'll visit Tuskegee, stand where they stood, touch the aircraft they flew. Maybe you'll apply their lessons to your own life, using their example as inspiration when you face your own challenges. Or maybe you'll simply remember. Remember that in the 1940s, a group of black men were told they couldn't fly, that biology itself prevented it, that science proved it impossible. And they flew anyway. They flew so well that bomber crews requested them specifically. They flew so effectively that their loss record was unmatched. They flew so courageously that even their enemies respected them. They proved that the limitations imposed on them were lies, maintained through prejudice and enforced through power, but lies nonetheless. The truth was in the sky, in every mission completed, every bomber brought home, every enemy aircraft shot down. The truth couldn't be denied forever. It took decades for full recognition to come, and even now, the recognition isn't complete. But the truth persisted. That's the power of action over words. You can argue about whether someone can do something, or you can watch them do it. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't waste time arguing. They did it. And in doing it, they changed America. The German pilots who thought Negro pilots would be easy targets, they learned otherwise, often fatally. The American commanders who doubted black aviators could handle combat. The evidence proved them wrong, though some never admitted it. The system that claimed scientific justification for segregation, it lost credibility with every mission the Red Tails flew, and a century later, we're still learning from their example, still drawing strength from their story, still confronting the questions they force us to ask. If they could achieve excellence despite those obstacles, what's your excuse? If they could persist despite constant discrimination, what's stopping you? If they could fight for a country that didn't fully accept them, how committed are you to fighting for justice? These aren't comfortable questions. They're meant to challenge, to provoke, to inspire. The Tuskegee Airmen's legacy isn't just about the past. It's about now. It's about the barriers that still exist and the people still fighting to break them. It's about the excellence that's still demanded of marginalized communities and the persistent refusal to accept limitations. It's about the long arc of justice and the people who pull it forward, inch by painful inch, through courage and sacrifice and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. If you found yourself moved by this story, if the red tails reminded you that the impossible is often just the not yet accomplished, then carry that forward. Share the story. Make sure these men are not forgotten. They earned that much at least. Earned it in the skies over Europe, in the struggle for recognition, in the ongoing fight for equality their service helped advance. The Tuskegee Airmen, told they couldn't fly, proved they could soar, dismissed as inferior, demonstrated excellence, denied recognition, eventually claimed their place in history. Their story doesn't end here. It echoes forward, waiting for the next person who needs to hear it. The next moment when someone needs proof that what seems impossible isn't. The next generation that needs heroes who faced challenges they recognize. The echo continues. Make sure it never stops. They said black men couldn't fly. But in the Italian skies, painted red tails cut through clouds, escorting bombers home, proving every doubter wrong with every mission. The Luftwaffe stopped scoffing. The bomber crews started praying for red tail escorts. And history, though it took its time, eventually recorded the truth. The Tuskegee Airmen were among the finest pilots who ever flew, and they earned that distinction despite obstacles that would have stopped lesser men. They didn't just change military aviation. They changed America's understanding of what was possible. They opened doors that had been bolted shut. They proved that excellence knows no color, that courage transcends race, that the only real limitations are the ones we artificially impose. Remember their names: Benjamin O. Davis Jr., Charles Hall, Lee Archer, Roscoe Brown, Joseph Ellsbury, and the hundreds of others whose names deserve to be spoken, remembered, honored. Remember what they faced and what they overcame. Remember that. Their victory wasn't inevitable, wasn't guaranteed, came only through extraordinary effort and sacrifice. Remember that justice delayed is still worth fighting for. Remember that change, real systemic change, requires generations of persistent effort. Remember that excellence matters, even when it's not immediately recognized. Remember that courage is acting despite fear, not never feeling it. Remember that their story is part of a larger story, a continuing story, a story you're part of whether you realize it or not. The Tuskegee Airmen fought on two fronts, against fascism abroad and racism at home. They won victories on both, though the second front is still contested. Their weapons were skill, courage, discipline, and an unshakable belief in their own worth despite a society that denied it. Those weapons are still available. Those battles are still being fought. Their example still guides. As we close, remember this: the laughter of their doubters died in the Italian skies. The lies about capability were shattered by documented achievement. The attempt to erase their legacy was defeated by persistent truth-telling, and the echo of what they accomplished continues through you, through everyone who hears and shares their story, through every person who faces doubt and remembers that decades ago, some men from across America proved that nothing is impossible when you refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose. The red tails flew. They fought. They won. They came home to injustice, but never stopped pushing for justice. They waited decades for recognition, but never stopped telling their truth. They faced everything a racist society could throw at them, and they prevailed. Not completely, not perfectly, but significantly. And that matters. That changes things. That ripples forward. The sky called them. They answered. And in answering, they showed us all what's possible. When courage meets opportunity. When excellence confronts prejudice. When determined people refuse to accept no as a final answer. Their story lives. Their legacy continues. Their example remains. Make sure it never fades. They earned that immortality in the skies over Europe, and we owe them the remembrance. The red tails, told they couldn't fly, proved the world wrong, and in doing so, helped change that world forever. Their engines have long since quieted. Their aircraft rest in museums. But their spirit soars still, carried forward by everyone who refuses to accept artificial limits, who fights for justice despite the odds, who believes that excellence and courage can overcome even the most entrenched prejudice. They were right to believe it. They proved it. And their proof endures. Evidence that cannot be erased. Truth that cannot be denied. The Tuskegee Airmen. The Red Tails. American heroes, finally recognized, forever remembered. Their story is our story. Their fight is our fight. Their victory is our inheritance and our responsibility. Carry it forward. Honor it. Share it. Make sure the echo never stops. They flew so that others could soar. Now it's our turn to lift others up, to break down barriers, to prove again that the only real limitations are the ones we accept. The Red Tails showed us the way. The sky is still waiting. The question is, will you answer the call?